Happy Halloween everyone, and as we all know, around this time of year, the barrier between our world and the world of the damned, the spiritual, the mischievous and haunted begin to fade, allowing some not so nice things to cross over into our world. Tonight we will be covering 3 stories, each of them unique and horrifying in their own way, and each of them spooky enough for a Halloween night. Be prepared to have your wits shaken, your heart racing, and your breath taken away. So, grab a drink. My choice today is Tears of the Innocent. A bit salty. And join me as we explore these haunting, chilling Halloween tales. No trespassing. Peggy and her boyfriend Tommy were driving down a lonely stretch of dark road when a thunderstorm came crashing down on them. Tommy slowed the car down and they crept past a noticeable abandoned house. Plastered all over the fences and trees of the house were no trespassing signs. A mile past the house, the car started to slid. Peggy screamed as the car slid off the road and into the nearby gully. The car slammed into a large boulder as it slowly came to rest under a pecan tree. Peggy's head banged against the window and a sharp pain shot up through her arm and shoulder. Tommy turned to her. "Are you alright? You're bleeding." "Shoulder," Peggy barely managed to gasp. Tommy glanced cautiously at her right arm. "I think your arm is broken," he said. "I'm gonna call for help." But neither of them had their cell phone, because this was in the 1500s apparently. "That house we just passed probably has a cell phone that we can use," Tommy said. Peggy's eyes popped wide open. Despite her pain, she remembered the creepy old house. "Stay here. A car will come," she said. "I can't stay, Peggy. It could take hours for another car to come. And you're losing too much blood." He then went out to the trunk to retrieve a couple of blankets and covered Peggy with them. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he said. He raced out into the storm, shutting the dented car door behind him, while Peggy drifted into a kind of daze. Something in the back of her mind was making her very uneasy. She slid down the seat onto the floor and put her head back on the seat, completely covering herself with the blankets. She then allowed the weariness from the accident and the injuries to take her slowly into a sleep. Peggy wasn't sure what had woke her. Had a beam of light shone briefly through the blanket? Did she hear someone cursing outside? She strained her eyes and ears, but heard nothing but the rain and thunder, and no light shone through the blanket now. If Tommy had arrived with a rescue team, then surely there would be lights and noises and voices, but she heard nothing but the rain, thunder, and swishing of the pecan tree. These sounds should have been comforting, but they were not. Goosebumps crawled all over her arms, even her broken one, and she almost stopped breathing for a while, as some deep part of her mind told her to keep still and not make a noise. She did not know how long fear kept her immobile, but suddenly the raw terror ceased, and she sensed that something terrible had happened. Then she stopped herself. It was just the accident and her sore, weary head making things up. She was imagining things, and somewhat comforted by this thought, she dozed off again. Peggy wasn't sure how long she'd been asleep for when she was awakened by a bright light blazing through the window and the sound of multiple male voices outside. The door was wrenched open and someone crawled inside. She lifted up her head from the blankets and saw a young state policeman. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, and then turned over his shoulder to call for help. Peggy told them her story and begged them to look for her boyfriend Tommy. They avoided answering her and instead called the paramedics. As the paramedics carried her carefully up the slope back towards the road, Peggy looked back at the car and saw a grotesque figure hanging from the branches of the pecan tree. For a moment, her brain couldn't decipher what she was seeing. It almost looked abstract. And then she started screaming in terror. One of the policemen rushed over to block her view of the tree, as one of the paramedics rushed to give her a sedative, just as her mind finally registered what she saw. Tommy's mangled dead body was hanging from the pecan tree, and nailed to the center of his chest was a no trespassing sign. This is the story of vengeance. When the samurai warrior Kaito first came to California from Tokyo, he brought his new wife, the beautiful Ishii. She was the ideal wife, gentle, attentive, a brilliant cook. Kaito was the envy of all of his neighbors, but he was a proud man. When a wealthy family moved into the neighborhood, Kaito cast his eye upon their lovely daughter, Aiko, and desired her greatly. Now, in his mind, Ishii was second best. So Kaito plotted to rid himself of his wife so that he could win over the fair Aiko. On a stormy night on the way home from a banquet, the couple went out for a walk and Kaito pushed Ishii off a cliff and into the bay. No one heard her scream through the howling wind. Kaito came rushing back to the banquet hall, shouting for help and playing the part of the grieving husband perfectly. No one suspected any foul play. His wife had simply slipped and fallen off the cliff. An incredible tragedy. He played his role perfectly and gave Ishii an incredible funeral. And it wasn't until he was alone in his house that Kaito relaxed and drank to his success. Outside, the wind whipped against the house, making the walls rattle and shake. A stray breeze swept through the room with a whisper. Vengeance. Kaito sat up and blinked as a dark figure entered the room. Its long, tangled black hair hung over the dirty, blood-stained kimono. Its face was crushed and broken, with one eyeball hanging out of its socket. The ghost of Ishii reached out with a broken hand and smiled at him through broken teeth. Vengeance, she whispered. Vengeance. Kaito screamed in terror, leapt out through the window, and ran straight to a neighbor's house. Mistaking his fear for grief, the neighbors took him in and insisted that they stay with him for at least a few weeks. An entire month passed, as Kaito waited for Ishii's ghost to reappear, but it seemed she had vanished. So, relieved, Kaito decided it was safe to bring Aiko and her family over to see his home. As he escorted Aiko's parents around the garden, Kaito turned around and found the beautiful Ishii, who kissed him and whispered in his ear, vengeance. Laughing, Ishii danced away, waving to Aiko and her parents as she passed. Fearing that this might somehow mess up the betrothal, Kaito pressed forward, arranging a grand feast to prove his devotion. Friends, family, and neighbors all came to the banquet hall and had great laughs and toasts over food and wine. Kaito was very pleased with this success. But when he looked across the hall, he saw the beautiful ghost of young Ishii walk into the room and stand menacingly in the corner. He paused mid-sentence and stared in horror as she laughed and began to change form. Her beautiful body began to break and twist before Kaito's eyes, her face collapsing inwards, her black hair tangling up, her eyeball popping out of its socket. Vengeance, she whispered. Kaito screamed, and around him, Aiko, her parents, the guests, they all stared at him. No one else could see Ishii, and as she drifted out of the door, Kaito followed her, vowing that she would haunt him no more. Ishii drifted out along the cliff path, with Kaito following her, screaming and shouting. Suddenly, she stopped at the point where Kaito had thrown her off the cliff. She turned to face Kaito and started to grow, her crushed body bloody and dirty, her eyeball swaying, her shattered teeth glowing in the moonlight. Vengeance, she screamed, and lunged at Kaito. He stepped backwards, completely terrified. His foot slipped suddenly on the loose earth, and he plunged backwards over the edge of the cliff, with his body being fatally crushed onto the rocks below. That same night, a terrible storm beat against Kaito's home. Lightning hit the roof, and the house burnt to the ground. Neighbors claimed that they could hear a voice in the wind. The voice of a woman saying one word, vengeance. The face. The medical student toppled into love as soon as he set his eyes on Sheila, the beautiful new transfer student. She had masses of long black hair and eyelashes so long that they got tangled in her curls when she leant over the desk. The medical student had a withdrawn nature, but not by inclination. He'd learned the hard way that people typically avoided him when they heard about his insane father locked away in an asylum. But he had to overcome his quiet nature or avoid losing Sheila to one of the other boys. So he volunteered to tutor Sheila for one of her classes. And after that, it was easy. Sheila toppled into love with him just as he was madly in love with her. And they went everywhere together. The medical student lived in a bubble of joy until one day he saw Sheila talking with a handsome looking fellow who lived in the same dorm. They were laughing together over something one of their professors had said in history class, and a pain of sheer jealousy cut through the medical student. How dare she laugh with another man? He confronted Sheila about this and she stared at him in shock. "You are crazy," she said, and he winced at this insult, reminded of his father. She walked off and they later made up over dinner. Things were fine for a while until Sheila asked to borrow a pen from a handsome blonde fellow in the library. This set him off again. They hissed and shouted angry words at each other until the librarian kicked them out of the library. They went their separate ways, cooled down, and then he later called Sheila and apologized. She accepted his apology and they were seemingly back to normal. The medical student was scheduled to take Sheila to the local dance on Friday night. So he picked up Sheila, escorted her there, and the couple had a fantastic evening. Dancing, drinking, eating. They left the party at around midnight and walked back hand in hand to their dorm. When they reached their dorm, Sheila asked one of her male classmates about an assignment that was due this week, and the medical student was instantly filled with rage and jealousy. When Sheila rejoined him, they went upstairs to his room, and he shouted at her, "You flirt with every man you meet, you tramp." "You are crazy," Sheila shouted, stark raving mad. Then he saw red. "Don't call me mad." His hand reached down into his bag and found a scalpel from one of his classes. When the mists cleared from his eyes, Sheila lay dead at his feet, her throat cut from ear to ear. The whole room was covered in red blood, and her masses of black hair lay about the floor. The medical student's brain went into overdrive. Hide the body, clean up the blood, invent an alibi. But first, he stared down at the girl that he had loved so much, knelt beside the body, and slowly cut off her face. He wrapped the face carefully in plastic before putting it in his desk drawer. Then he cleaned up all of the blood and hid the body. The next morning, the medical student told his roommate that Sheila had broken up with him that night and gone home in a huff. The roommate appeared to accept this story and didn't appear to notice the strange obsessive way that the medical student would often peer into his desk drawer. He finally tore himself away from Sheila's face to attend his 11 o'clock class, and when he returned at lunchtime, he found his roommate staring off out the window, looking terribly ill. His roommate turned white and practically ran from the room. The medical student shrugged, sat down, and peered into the drawer at Sheila's face. Then he smiled and settled down to work on a paper that was due next week. And downstairs, his roommate was on the phone to the police. The medical student went ballistic when police came to arrest him. They wrestled him out of his chair while a grim-faced police officer looked into the drawer. When they saw the dead girl's face, one of the officers swore violently and threw up on the floor. The medical student was placed in an asylum with his father, who was locked away in a padded room next door. Every day, while his enraged father tried to kill the attendants, the medical student simply wept and stared out of the window, seeing Sheila's lovely face in the branches of a nearby tree. The face seemed to sway to the rhythm of his father's fists, pounding and pounding against the walls of his cell. And back in the dorm, the ghost of the young girl in a blood-soaked dress still haunts and floats along the hallways, searching for her face. And that is all we have time for. I hope you enjoyed this extra special Halloween episode, as personally Halloween is my favorite holiday of the entire year. But I hope I didn't scare too many of you too badly. Stay safe, stay curious. As always, thanks for watching, and for this episode, happy Halloween.